So Ron, I have some questions for you in follow-up to your last session on Greek thought and how we ought to think through that more clearly and embrace what we can of it in terms of our faith and especially the contemplative directions we're taking. So some of the questions begin this way. One is that there's this fallacy that Greek thought and Greek language are an abstraction. And I wondered if you'd address how the Greek's language is actually rich with more than abstractions, and then how this works out ethically with individuals and politically with societies.
Yeah, I mean, the notion that the Greek tradition is abstract and rational, the Hebrew tradition is concrete and poetic, is just a very simplistic and almost Sunday school caricature. The Greek tradition, even in Plato's stories, he'll constantly blend what he calls mythos and logos. He'll tell a story, say, the popular one most people know is the cave one. The notion of people realizing they live in a world of shadows. How do you leave and then returning in love to be part of the transformation? The notion of the human soul driving a chariot, the dark horse and the light horse, and depending on the horse that pulls the chariot of the soul, you're going to end up in different places. The notion of the soul, the ship of state, or the soul is a ship with many different desires, like sailors on the ship, and he or she who captains the ship, if you allow mutiny of different desires, the ship's going to go over the water of time. The Greeks were full of, they would constantly illustrate what they were doing in terms of their way of knowing through story, through metaphor, through picture. And Plato, like Aristotle, they do this all the time, as does Socrates. You can't, when you look at the Platonic dialogues in Socrates, there's one story after another that can't be missed. So in terms of how they attempt to convey truth and insight, there is poetic, there is grounded, as anything you'll get in the Hebrew tradition. Also, I would argue you won't get anything in the Hebrew tradition that matches the sophistication of Plato thinking through what is friendship, or Aristotle, what is friendship? What's the nature of the virtues and the vices? And to the degree one sorts and sifts through that in a very subtle, layered way. I mean, it's comparable to what people do in spiritual discernment today. In that sense, Plato and Aristotle are forerunners in terms of the delicacy that they have in terms of looking at the nature of the human soul and spirit and body. And again, some people pit, the Greeks, you have spirit, pneuma, suke, and then you have sarx, and the Greeks separate. No, they're highly integrated. So the level of political thinking in Plato and Aristotle goes far beyond anything that you'll get in not only biblical thought, but even early Jewish philosophical thought as well. So I would argue, if one's going to sort of take this argument, I would argue, in fact, the Hebrew tradition is less developed in terms of some of these bigger political, economic issues than is the classical Greek tradition. And the Greek tradition is very grounded in history, very grounded in the moment, very grounded in people and friendships and virtues and vices and contemplation in the polis and the city-state and all of these things. And so to dismiss them as Gnostic, as rationalist, as undermining, it's just a sheer distortion of people who really, if you ask them, tell me what you've read of, the tragedians, or Herodotus, or Homer, or Demosthenes, or something. Usually what you've got is very crude generalizations that really are not grounded in anything factual in a substantive way in classical Athenian spirituality.
Now, it seems to me that you have, even before the time of the New Testament, some real integration of Greek and Jewish thought in people like Philo. And it looks to me like Philo has seen how Plato's critique of the fickleness of the Homeric gods, the polytheism and so on, has led Plato to say, no, God is good and only good, and all he does is good. And Philo wants to pick up on that and say the same thing about Judaism's God. That Judaism's God is not fickle. He doesn't turn on you one day and sort of lie to you the next day and so on, but there's this constancy in him. I'm wondering if you could address how Jews like Philo had done this integration, and then how that appears in, really, we do have a Jewish Greek New Testament in that sense of integration.
Yeah, very much. Well, Philo himself is, he's one of the key figures, obviously, in Jewish philosophic, theological thought, grappling with how you read, in his case, the Jewish text, how you make sense of the God who is a warrior God, the God who commands people to be violent, also the God who calls people to be just and peacemaking. And so after this classical period of Athenian civilization, you had Philip of Macedon tried to take over and integrate that whole area, and then with that you get the thinning out of classical Greek thought into what's called Hellenism, and largely through Alexander the Great, which Alexandria city emerges from. And so many Greeks who were more theological and philosophical, not just devotional, they were asking, how do we make sense of the Hebrew canon when we're getting mixed messages? And sometimes the, Jehovah or El Shaddai or Elohim sometimes can appear a bit like Zeus in terms of what he's commanding the Jews to do. And so what's really the difference between the Jewish notion of God, particularly the more violent, the choosing what you do to other people who are not Jewish, versus a prophetic side? And if God is good, then is that God who is commanding people to wipe out, to commit genocide? And so people like Philo are very much grappling with this notion of certain, well, in one sense, the language theologically is anthropomorphisms, in which we project human notions onto the divine, and then the danger of that, then God becomes a plaything of our own nationalist or personal desires. So Philo's grappling with that. So here in Philo, you're getting the Hellenization of Judaism, very sophisticated philosopher, and he's going to have an immense impact in, say, in elements of Alexandrian Christianity, because they're asking exactly the same question. If Christ comes, he's God incarnate, he would prefer, he allows violence to be done to him rather than enacting violence. How do you make sense of that with a God who commands violence and wiping out and genocide of other people? And so that whole Alexandrian tradition, which certainly in the Jewish tradition, Philo is a part of a bigger Jewish philosophic tradition, dealing with anthropomorphisms, dealing with certain understanding of myth, and trying to have a much more contemplative. Philo is very much a part of emergence of a layered Jewish exegetical tradition, which will be picked up, and so topology and allegory and contemplative hermeneutic is very much at work, as well as the literal in Philo. The Alexandrian tradition of Pontinus, Clement, and Origen is going to pick up on that, as is sophisticated elements of Antiochian Christianity. They're not just literal, grammatical, historical, as some that make them out to be. They're very sophisticated. So, and then obviously the New Testament is in Koine Greek. It's drawing from a variety of it's using Greek language, and so the fact that it's using the Greek language, it's to some degree you're thinking within a Greek mindset in that sense. So as I mentioned earlier, say John himself, the whole prologue, the book of John, is an outworking of the logos spermatikos, the nature of logos. Logos, for some people, again, tend to think logos is this rational understanding, whereas Greek thought is very much, logos is the living presence of that which is. And so to reduce it to a rational principle, it's again to superimpose a very modern understanding, sort of Baconian, Cartesian understanding of reason on a classical civilization which didn't think that way at all. To them, logos was that which is. And the task of the contemplative way was how to be present to the presencing of that which is present. And that's what the logos is, and it was incarnate Christ, and in Christ you get the fullness. And so, again, the concreteness of Christ and the presencing of the logos. And so,
Could I add that the most Jewish of the New Testament books are also the most Platonic? So, for example, Hebrews to the Hebrews is all about the shadow and the reality. But also, James' epistle begins in chapter 1, that this God in him is no shadow of turning.
Yes.
And this is the true immutability that he's picked up. So it's almost ironic that the most Platonic books are the most Jewish books, and the integration had already happened by the time they're writing the New Testament.
Oh, definitely, yeah. And so, yeah, you have a whole stream of Jewish thought, which has very much been influenced by classical Greek Hellenism, and it was seen as just a part of the revelatory nature of the faith. So those who pit Athens against Jerusalem, they're very, very much distorting the reality of classical Christian thought, which saw all these as means of divine grace.
Now, I've heard also that there's pushback on some of the early Christian dogmas of the faith. For example, we've got the doctrine of immutability, which I just take to be what James is saying, that in him there's no shadow of turning, or 1 John, that he's light and in him there's no darkness at all. And yet there's almost this caricature where immutability is Aristotle's unmoved mover, and that the stasis or constancy of who God is, and God is that he's like this static wall or a piece of granite that's not relational. And then, of course, the open theists go to town on that. How do you respond to that?
Well, again, what you're getting is this Athens-Jerusalem character, and of course, when people play that game, they inevitably caricature or reduce classical Athenian theology. Yeah, so that the ultimate is like this, and if you can make God feel pain, then you're influencing God, and you have control over the ultimate or the divine. And all immutability is that essentially there's certain things that don't change in God. Okay, that is love,
like
that is
love.
goodness. Yeah, and that's what Plato, that's what Aristotle, this is what the metaphysics is trying to get at. And so to dismiss Greek theology as our tendencies, our responses, we can't make God react to us. If we did so, it wouldn't be God. God would be a plaything of our wants, needs, responses. Very much distorts the notion of immutability. So in Greek theology, you certainly get the notion that God is immutably good, God is immutably that which is, but God is immutably present through the Logos, obviously in Christ as the Word made flesh, but before the Word made flesh in that very concrete sense, there was the Logos was always being present to people, to civilizations, to thinkers, to politics. And so, yeah, so I would think those who want to, again, there's this distortion of seeing the Greeks in a certain way, but we're the real ones where, that God is active, loving, engaging, responding, but the Greeks' notion of the God is not like that. That's just yet another distortion, like the Greeks are rationalists, or the Greeks are Gnostics, or the Greek philosophy undermines theology. There's yet another caricature that comes in.
Now, one of the things that I see in Charles Williams' writing is that he doesn't see the kind of dualism that the Greeks are accused of, as if you've got the earthly sphere and the heavenly sphere parallel but not touching somehow, but rather he sees how, and I think this is Platonic as well, he sees how the heavenly realm is the source of the material realm and the infrastructure of the material realm. Does that?
Very much so.
So who are these? Could you just share? Who are some of the great Christian Platonists of the 20th century?
Well, I mean, you mentioned Charles Williams in terms of the inklings and key figures. I mean, Williams was placed the line. Well, any of Williams' great works, he's looking at almost the notion of what does the forms look like in terms of the living forms, not intellectual forms we can dissect, but actually a form contains the presence of that which is. And so the place of the lion, you encounter real lions, as it were, as was Lewis in, say, the Chronicles of Narnia. So Charles Williams would definitely stand within that classical Platonic Christian tradition. Very good friend of Williams, obviously, C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis brilliant Anglican, Platonic Christian. Many people read Lewis, and they obviously are totally, they'll read, the science fiction or something, or the children's stories, or the apologetics works, but don't realize the deeper grounding of Lewis's works is deeply Platonic. And so George Grant, one of the great, obviously, he's worked with C.S. Lewis in the Socratic Club when he was doing his PhD at Oxford. Brilliant, probably one of the most outstanding Canadian Christian Platonists. He was deeply influenced by Simone Weil, who you did your PhD on, and Grant and Weil. Simone Weil, another exquisitely insightful Christian Platonist. Iris Murdoch, who was in the Socratic Club with them. And so there's many Christian Platonists who have played a very, very significant role in terms of being essential, recognizing that Plato is the deeper philosophic thinker that stands back of how they understand their faith in terms of the contemplative journey, and Plato's analysis of the human soul and how the ordering of desires and what happens when our desires are not ordered properly. It throws the whole soul off, and we begin to lose our way. And so the level, Plato is probably one of the preeminent spiritual directors of Western civilization when he's understood properly. His analysis of complex human desires, the clash between desires, the ordering of desires, what Augustine will pick up on in terms of the ordo amoris, the ordering of our loves. These all come out of Plato, and so Middle Platonism. So
now some would want to conserve that tradition. I would want to, and yet you have the progressivists come along and say, well, we've really moved beyond that, and you've got the Taylor and de Chardin. You want to share a little bit about that tradition?
Yeah, Charles Taylor, as some of you are aware, is probably one of the most preeminent North American, even European philosophers of the latter half of the 20th century, early decades of the 21st century. Taylor's won a couple of very major awards worth $1 million because of his life vocation as a philosopher. Taylor very, very much draws from a Hegelian notion in terms of the dialectic of history, in that history moves progressively ever forward, and that which is behind us lacks the depth, the insight in terms of the consciousness of liberty. And so the story of history unfolds progressively and positively. Therefore, those in the past were not as well informed, did not understand things as well in terms of liberty and the consciousness of it. So why would you study the Greeks if in fact, the ongoing movement of history is more enlightened than the past? This is what C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery in that sense. So when people start from a notion, and it can be influenced by Hegel, that history is this ongoing unfolding of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and we're becoming more enlightened, more insightful as people, then the past is only interested in terms of archaeological work or archivism, but certainly not a substantive insight in terms of a contemplation. Teilhard de Chardin, in one sense, is doing something similar, very important to many sort of progressive Catholics, trying to look at how one can bring together religion, science, and evolution in terms of an omega point. But what underlies that philosophically, the deeper problem is, if history is ever moving upward in terms of a more positive, enlightened, evolutionary way, what's the significance of the past, i.e. classical Greek civilization? Well, it's at a lower level, okay? And so, of course, when you start with the Hegelian dialectic in Taylor, or the Teilhard de Chardin notion that we're moving towards an omega point, then the past itself is somewhat dimmer than the light that we're increasingly experiencing. And so if you got that sort of evolutionary notion, or the Hegelian notion of forward march of history, then why study the Greeks? So they end up getting demeaned, they get dismissed as not quite as on the cusp of intellectual, of cultural, civilizational civilization. Or there's also the whole movement, what's called the second axial age, by many people interested in the contemplative, the merging of all these great civilizations and great mystical traditions of world civilizations. And what they end up doing, they end up distorting that which doesn't fit into their synthesis. And so the whole second axial age thinkers as well, they fit into that Hegelian, Taylor, Chardin, and that's another big school that again caricatures classical Athenian spirituality. And so what these three groups are doing, they essentially shut us off. They close the door on the richness of classical Athenian spirituality by essentially caricaturing it, distorting it, and thereby preventing us from dining at that great feast that is a part of the great heritage of Western civilization and culture, and what it can offer in terms of a meaningful understanding of contemplative Christianity.
Now I want to address some of the issues around the Torrance Brothers, who are very popular, and I want to give them the benefit of the doubt to begin with. So I'll present my best case for them, and yet I see a dismissiveness in their text. So first of all, the case that I think can be made for them, first of all, is that they've done a great service in calling us to see the Godhead as this communal Trinity, the life of the Trinity that has engaged us through the incarnation. And because of that, they've done very good work on Athanasius, and sometimes seem to speak out of the heart of Athanasius about both the Trinity and how what Christ has done in the incarnation brings us into the Trinitarian community. That's all really important, I think. And it is rooted in the early church fathers, and they've done some good work on the Nicene Creed, for example. But as I'm reading that, then I'll see pushback around the Greeks. Here seems to be the concerns. One is they're nervous about an abstracted logos that without reference to the incarnation, but also Plato's idea of the one. And so they're worried about a bare monotheism that doesn't take seriously the Trinitarian community that makes God love, in a sense. And so my first reaction to that would be, well, look at what Plato is speaking against polytheism towards monotheism. That's already a good move. And then from there, then we can talk about how the incarnation fulfills what Plato even foresaw, that if the good would manifest in the world, it would manifest as the perfectly righteous man who we would then arrest, torture, and crucify. So I'm wanting the Trinitarian Torrance fans to hear the value rather than being so dismissive of what the Greeks bring to the Christian table, rather than thinking, oh, this was an infection that we need to extract somehow. What are your thoughts on where the Torrance is coming from and how we might respond?
Well, obviously, sort of the Trinitarian position that emerged certainly in the early church. You can't expect Plato to be talking about Father, Son, and Spirit. Plato's centuries before that. But as you say, first of all, Plato's very clearly going after a form of polytheism in which essentially the gods are anthropomorphic, they're projections of humans. So he would very much be with early Christianity in terms of critiquing, one, anthropomorphisms and a lot of theology, even dealing with the Hebrew tradition, at what point certain images of God are anthropomorphic in that sense. So he can't be blamed for not being Trinitarian. This is, but certainly early Christianity argued that logos was at work, in Plato's thinking, the seed of the word. Now the growth of that seed as it breaks through the shell and comes up through the soil, and the full tree, the full theological tree of Trinitarian theology is important. The one question I would have is to overly emphasize the theological and underly emphasize the anthropological. You're still living in a world of ultimates.
Yeah.
The the Greeks were very interested. So what's the relationship of your understanding of the ultimate with the penultimate? And this is where our journey from who we are not, from our false self, from the shadow self, to the ultimate is a process of, well, Socrates' philosophy is about dying. It's about letting go. It's about sifting these things. So to overly emphasize the ultimate theological and underplay the penultimate nature of the human journey of transformation and how that takes place. The existential contemplative, as found in Athenian Greek spirituality, is very important. And so my question always would be is, okay, so that's one thing. You've talked about ultimate issues, the nature of Father, Son, and Spirit, and how that comes together, and the Athanasian understanding of that. But what's the relationship of that to the deification and transformation of people on their all-too-human journey to be one, the unio mystica in that sense? And that's where the Greeks are very valuable, because they're very concrete. They want to know, so what are the paths we can take that lead us to cul-de-sacs that distort? What are the sailors on the ship that can cause mutiny on the Bounty? And so I would always, my deeper question is, what's the relationship between the mystery of the ultimate and the penultimate journey to that ultimate? And that's the contemplative transformative journey, which classical Athenian spirituality is very concrete on, and it's much more existential, and it's much more about transformation and deification. And so this merging of theology and anthropology, and this is why I think a lot of people are interested in the contemplative, because, okay, we've talked about these ultimate issues, but so what's the relationship of that to my all-too-human journey of transformation and deification? And if that question isn't asked, we're playing, in one sense, an interesting theological chess game with ideas, which has its place, but if there's not a merging of theology and anthropology, or theology and contemplative spirituality, then theology itself can be a distraction.
Yeah, and I mean, Simone Weil, she did see across Greek culture, whether it was their philosophy, ethics, politics, mathematics, architecture, artwork, she says all of it was a quest for mediation between the ultimate and the penultimate, and that is fulfilled ultimately in the hypostatic union of creator and created in the person of Christ. And so in that sense, it feels like Socrates asked the right question, Christ embodies the right answer. The early church saw this embodiment and expressed it using Platonic categories precisely against Gnostic dualism and so on.
Okay. Oh yeah, no, the Greeks were, I mean, all the great Greek thinkers were about mediation, bridges. What's the bridge? What's the bridge we walk between time and eternity, ultimate and penultimate? If it was just ultimate and you exclude the penultimate, that's an interesting philosophic, theological game that can be played. But what's that got to do with my life? Now, if people just want to do the penultimate in time and history, then the transcendent is cut off. But the Greeks, the notion of metaxis and all of these issues, it's very much about the bridge building between the impermanence of time and the permanence of eternity, and how do we live in these worlds. So yeah, the notion that somehow Greek thought is not about mediation, at the center of all of Greek thought is mediation.
Yeah, I know that, for example, my good friend Baxter Kruger, what makes him nervous about metaxis is the emphasis on separation there, whereas what he's all about is union. And yet it seems to me union is the response to it's, in fact, it's a no to separation. The Greeks didn't think dualistically like that. Well, that's again, I'm using a big term, the Greeks, but this idea of what, so if we ask what is Platonism, bottom line, are we saying Platonism taught that, or teaches that the material world is not the ultimate reality, that there is an undergirding infrastructure to...
Well, of course, yeah, and but in terms of a sacramental understanding, the material world is an icon, not an idol, and so eternity shines through time, and to the degree we are receptive to that shining through, light coming to us, we will see shadows for what they are. We will know what it means to leave the world of shadows, but also in love return to those who confuse shadows with reality. Always important to distinguish between Plato and Platonism as well. But I think one of the great dilemmas, as I mentioned earlier, is this blending of ignorance and arrogance. People dismiss the Greeks, and then you say, yeah, and have you read all of Plato? Have you read Aristotle? Have you read Homer? Do you know the historians? And what you get is usually get a blank stare, or you got a few little lines quoted out of context in the unfolding chronological life of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, or the tragedians or the pre-Socratics. And so you get these, interesting enough, from fairly educated people, very uneducated responses to a whole civilization, which essentially did a great deal to mature Christianity and create Western civilization as such. And of course, it's not Jewish versus Greek or versus Roman. It's the great integration and the unity of them. And I might add, probably one of the most important scholars in terms of looking at this is Werner Jager. And often when people think of people interpreting the Greeks, they'll think of Leo Strauss and Erich Vogelin or Nietzsche or Heidegger. But one of the men which has been ignored again and again, he's probably one of the most important, is this big 3 volumes on Paideia, and then of course the early Christians looked up. So there needs to be some really good return to people like Werner Jager, who really showed, and for Jaroslav Pelikan for that matter, in his Gifford Lectures and his 5 volumes, The Christian Tradition. So a reading of Jager and Pelikan will bring very to the fore. Jager probably more than Pelikan, because he was a classicist. This fusion of classical Greek thought with early Christian thought, and why early Christians drew from classical Athenian spirituality.